There are moments in life when we pause and ask ourselves, how did I get here? These moments are not just about success or recognition. They are about tracing our journey back to the roots that shaped us, the challenges that awakened us, and the fire that pushed us to stand tall. This is not just a story of one person. It is a reminder that every struggle, every choice, and every voice has the power to ignite change and leave a mark on the world. I was born into a home filled with discipline, compassion, and service. My parents, both doctors in the army, carried not only the weight of their duties, but also the responsibility of raising children who would value humanity above all else. Being the firstborn, I grew up constantly reminded that I was capable of greatness. Every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated with pride. My younger brother came along a few years later, yet nothing changed in how we were raised. We were given equal opportunities, something I believed was normal until I began to notice the world outside my home. Where I lived, equality between boys and girls was often the exception, not the rule. What felt ordinary to me, being encouraged, being educated, being supported, was, in truth, a privilege many girls were denied. This realization began to stir questions in my young heart, questions about fairness, about justice, and about why simply being a girl could determine the limits of one's life. That awareness was the seed of a lifelong mission. By the time I was 7 or 8, my parents started taking me along on their medical camps. We lived in a city called Berkeley, but they would drive into nearby villages and underserved communities in an old ambulance, carrying medicines and supplies. My role was small. I became their little pharmacist, counting tablets, sealing envelopes, and handing them to patients with a sense of pride. It felt like a game at first, but soon I noticed what my young eyes could not unsee: the world was not fair. Girls my age, bright and curious, were being pulled out of school the moment they reached puberty. They were told their purpose was marriage and motherhood, even at the tender age of 12 or 13. Boys, on the other hand, continued their education, free to dream bigger dreams. Even healthcare was unequal. Women were denied the right to basic treatment simply because they were women. These moments etched themselves deep within me. They were not fleeting observations. They were the first sparks of fire inside me, the first triggers that made me promise myself I would not just live, I would stand for change. As I grew older, life brought new opportunities, but also new challenges. Entering the entertainment world as a teenager was thrilling, yet it came with harsh realities. At just 18 or 19, I sat across from a producer who bluntly told me, "If you don't accept these terms, this low pay, I will simply replace you. Girls are replaceable in this business." His words stung, not because of the salary, but because of the belief that women could be discarded so easily. That day, something inside me shifted. I decided that I would never allow myself to be seen as disposable. If they thought girls were replaceable, I would prove myself to be irreplaceable. I sharpened my skills, worked harder than ever, and made choices that ensured my value could not be overlooked. Every insult became fuel. Every barrier became motivation. Looking back, I realized that challenge was not just a personal battle. It was another trigger, one more reason to fight for the dignity and worth of women everywhere. But perhaps the moment that shook me the most came years later, not on a stage, not in front of cameras, but quietly in my own home. One afternoon, I returned from a long day of work and found my housekeeper's daughter sitting in the corner of my library. She was 8 or 9, a sweet child who loved to read. Curious, I asked her why she wasn't in school that day. Her reply pierced me. "I don't go to school anymore." Confused, I asked her mother, who explained that their family could only afford to send one child to school. They chose her brothers because she would eventually marry and her education would be a waste. I was stunned. In that instant, the unfairness of it all became unbearably real. I could not just walk away. I decided then and there to cover her education. She deserved the same right to learn as any boy. That single encounter changed me. It was no longer about observing inequality. It became about action, about doing something tangible to rewrite the stories of girls like her. From that day forward, I carried a deep conviction: education is not charity, it is a right. The little girl in my library was only one of millions, but her story represented countless others who were silenced before they ever had a chance to speak. I knew I had to act, not just for her, but for many. Over time, I began supporting initiatives that ensured children, especially girls, had access to schools, books, and the freedom to dream. I partnered with organizations that fought against child marriage, child labor, and gender inequality. What inspired me most was realizing that when you educate a girl, you don't just transform her life, you transform her family, her community, and eventually the entire economy around her. A girl with knowledge becomes a woman with power, and a woman with power changes the world. This became my purpose, the reason I poured myself into causes bigger than my own ambitions. Because at the end of the day, what is success worth if it doesn't lift others along with you? The more I became involved, the more I realized how widespread the problem was. Statistics were not just numbers on a page, they were living realities. Around the world, millions of girls never step into a classroom, not because they lack intelligence or ambition, but because society denies them the chance. Early marriage, poverty, and cultural expectations rob them of opportunities before they even begin. I often thought back to my own childhood. What if my parents had not believed in equality? What if I had been told that my dreams were worthless? That thought alone terrified me. Education had been my weapon, my shield, my ladder, and I wanted every girl to have the same. Slowly, I began to understand that real change could only happen when voices joined together. One person can start a ripple, but it takes a collective wave to shift the tide. That's when I started using my own platform, not for glamour, but for purpose, to speak for those who had been silenced, standing on global stages, speaking into microphones, and sharing the stories of girls I had met was both empowering and humbling. I carried their voices with me, making sure the world could not ignore them. I spoke about the 12-year-old girl married off before she even understood what marriage meant, about the teenager forced to give up school to care for younger siblings, about the countless women denied healthcare simply because of gender. Every story was a reminder that privilege carries responsibility. I had been given the gift of visibility, and with that came the duty to use it for something greater than myself. There were times when people told me it wouldn't matter, that the system was too broken, too vast to fix. But I refused to believe that change begins with belief. Belief that one step, however small, leads to another. Belief that a voice raised in truth cannot be drowned out forever. And so I kept speaking, kept fighting, kept believing. In my journey, I discovered a profound truth: when you invest in girls, you invest in the future. Educating a girl does not just empower her, it empowers generations. She becomes a woman who can earn, who can make choices, who can shape her community. She becomes a mother who passes on the same values of strength and independence to her children. It's a chain reaction that lifts entire societies. Yet, despite decades of progress, inequality persists stubbornly. More than 15 million girls of primary school age may never learn to read or write. 15 million futures silenced before they ever begin. That number haunted me. But instead of despairing, it fueled my mission. I reminded myself of a beautiful saying: the hand that rocks the cradle shapes the destiny of the world. And yet, tragically, those very hands are too often bound by chains of inequality. My goal became clear: to break those chains, one story, one child, one opportunity at a time. But the work was never easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the scale of injustice felt overwhelming. I would see girls robbed of their futures, and my heart would ache with anger and helplessness. Yet, I always returned to the stories of hope. The girl who, with just a scholarship, blossomed into a doctor. The young woman who, after escaping child marriage, became a teacher determined to protect others from the same fate. These stories reminded me that change is possible, and even the smallest intervention can alter a life forever. One child saved from illiteracy, One girl rescued from early marriage, one woman given access to healthcare. Each is a victory worth fighting for. These victories kept me going, kept me believing that no matter how enormous the mountain of inequality seemed, every step we took was bringing us closer to the summit. And I knew I could not stop climbing. Through all of this, one principle guided me: resilience. Life will always test us. It will place obstacles in our path, whisper doubts in our ears, and try to convince us that our efforts are futile. But resilience is the art of rising again, stronger every time we fall. I had faced rejection, I had faced bias, I had faced the weight of being underestimated, but I learned to turn every setback into strength. That is what I wish every girl to know, that her worth is not defined by the limitations placed on her, but by the courage she shows in overcoming them. When I speak of resilience, I do not mean ignoring pain or pretending everything is easy. I mean facing the storm, standing tall, and saying, "You cannot break me." Because once a girl believes in her own strength, she becomes unstoppable. And an unstoppable girl is the beginning of an unstoppable world. Resilience was not just a personal lesson, it was a collective necessity. Around the world, I met countless women who embodied strength in silence. A mother walking miles every day just to fetch clean water for her children. A young widow who refused to beg, instead building a small business from scraps. A girl no older than 15, who stood up against her entire community to demand the right to go to school. These women were not in the headlines. They were not celebrated with awards or applause. Yet, they were the true heroes. They reminded me that resilience does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it survives quietly, refusing to give up. And I knew then that part of my duty was to amplify these whispers into voices the world could no longer ignore. Because hidden within every story of struggle is also a story of strength. And that strength is contagious when shared. One of the most powerful lessons I learned was that change requires courage, but also compassion. It is not enough to demand equality loudly. We must also understand the fears and traditions that hold societies back. In many communities, parents do not deny girls an education out of cruelty, but out of survival. They fear the unknown, fear breaking traditions that have existed for centuries. If their daughter marries early, it relieves financial pressure. If she stays home, it ensures her safety. These choices are rooted in circumstances, not in malice. Recognizing this helped me realize that real change comes from empathy. We cannot simply point fingers, we must extend hands. By offering solutions, by providing support, by showing parents a future where their daughter's education brings prosperity, we shift mindsets. It is in compassion that we find the power to transform not just laws or policies, but hearts. And so, my mission became twofold: to fight injustice directly and to build bridges of understanding. I invested in programs that not only sent girls to school, but also supported families with resources, so that keeping their daughters in education was no longer a burden, but a blessing. I advocated for healthcare for women, not just as a right, but as a necessity for healthier societies. I joined hands with organizations working tirelessly to prevent child marriage, to provide safe spaces for survivors of violence, and to give every child, regardless of gender, the tools to dream. What I discovered along the way was profound. When communities see the benefits of equality firsthand, resistance melts. A girl who graduates becomes a teacher, earns an income, supports her family, and suddenly the cycle shifts. The very same neighbors who once doubted now become advocates themselves. That is how transformation happens. Not overnight, but steadily, ripple by ripple. There were, of course, sacrifices. The more deeply I immersed myself in this work, the more criticism I faced. Some accused me of being unrealistic, of chasing ideals in a world that thrives on inequality. Others told me I was wasting my time, that traditions were too strong to challenge. There were even those who questioned my motives, assuming it was all for appearances. But I knew the truth. This was not about me. It was about the millions of children who deserved better. And if standing up for them meant being misunderstood, so be it. I learned that leadership is often lonely. When you dare to challenge norms, You will not always be celebrated. But true change has never been born from comfort. It has always been born from courage. And with every criticism, my resolve only grew stronger. Because I was not fighting for approval, I was fighting for justice. Still, there were moments of profound joy. Moments that reminded me why the struggle was worth it. I remember visiting a rural school where a group of young girls ran up to greet me, their faces glowing with excitement. One of them, barely 10 years old, held my hand tightly and said, "Because of you, I can dream." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of centuries. They reminded me that every effort, every sleepless night, every fight against inequality had meaning. These girls were no longer silent. They were learning, laughing, dreaming, and shaping a different tomorrow. And that to me was the greatest reward. Not fame, not recognition, but knowing that lives were being transformed. It was proof that hope is stronger than despair, and that even in the darkest corners of the world, light can break through when we dare to believe in it. Hope is a powerful force. I witnessed how it could transform an entire community. A girl's success story became a beacon for others. When one child from a village graduated, suddenly the neighbors began to wonder, if she can, why not my daughter? Slowly, doubt gave way to possibility. I realized that real change doesn't always begin with grand revolutions. It often starts with a single example. That is why I continued sharing stories of triumph, because each one carried the power to inspire many more. I wanted every girl to know that her dreams were not a luxury, but a right. I wanted every parent to see that investing in their daughters was not a burden, but a gift that returned tenfold. Hope once ignited spreads like wildfire, and I dedicated myself to lighting those sparks wherever I could, knowing that a world full of hopeful girls would eventually become a world full of powerful women. Yet, hope alone is not enough. It must be paired with action. I learned that for every inspiring story, there were countless others who still struggled in silence. Girls married off before they turned 14. Children forced into labor instead of classrooms. Survivors of violence who carried invisible scars that no one wanted to acknowledge. These realities reminded me that inspiration must lead to responsibility. It was not enough for me to speak. I had to act. So I committed myself to long-term partnerships with organizations, ensuring that resources reached the ground where they were needed most. I traveled to conflict zones, refugee camps, and remote villages, places where hope was fragile but still alive. Every handshake, every conversation, every tear-filled story became a promise I carried with me, a promise to never stop fighting for those who had been denied their chance. Through these experiences, I discovered the true meaning of purpose. Success, I realized, is not measured by wealth or applause, but by impact. What good is recognition if it does not lift others? What good is achievement if it is not shared? Purpose is what gives life depth, what turns struggles into lessons and victories into movements. My purpose became clear: to use every platform I had, every opportunity I received, to amplify the cause of equality. Purpose turned exhaustion into energy, criticism into motivation, and obstacles into stepping stones. It reminded me that no matter how overwhelming the fight seemed, every step mattered. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded me that each of us has the power to live with purpose. Whether we touch one life or 1 million, the ripple effect is real. Our purpose, no matter how small it may seem, can reshape the world in ways we may never fully see. Still, there were times when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. There were days I wanted to retreat, to escape the pain of hearing so many heartbreaking stories. But each time I thought of stopping, I remembered the faces of the girls I had met. Their resilience gave me courage. Their dreams gave me strength. They reminded me that the fight was not optional. It was essential. Because if those who had a voice remained silent, who would speak for the voiceless? If those who had the means turned away, who would stand with the powerless? The responsibility was not mine alone, it was ours collectively. I often told myself, if I can carry even a fraction of their burden, if I can make even the smallest difference, then I must continue. And so, Even in the moments of doubt, I chose to rise again, fueled by the unshakable belief that every child deserves a chance. Over the years, I began to see the impact of persistence. Girls who once had no future were now graduating. Women who were once silenced were now leading. Communities that once resisted change were now embracing it. Transformation is slow, sometimes painfully so, but it is inevitable when fueled by determination. And I realized something beautiful. This fight was never just about girls or women. It was about humanity itself. When we empower girls, we empower societies. When we give women opportunities, we strengthen economies. When we create equality, we create a world where everyone thrives. This truth kept me moving forward with conviction, because ultimately, the question is not whether change is possible. It is whether we are willing to fight for it. And as long as I have a voice, I will always choose to fight. The fight for equality is not a straight path. It is filled with victories and setbacks. There were times when governments pledged change, but failed to deliver. Times when laws were written but never enforced. And times when progress felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Yet, despite the challenges, I saw something remarkable. People were awakening. Ordinary citizens, students, teachers, and parents were beginning to question the old ways. They were daring to believe in a different future. This gave me hope that change is not only possible, but inevitable. Because when people awaken to truth, they cannot unsee it. They cannot return to silence. They demand better, they push harder, and they inspire others to join. And that is how movements are born, not from one person, but from many voices rising together, refusing to be ignored. One of the most powerful things I have learned is that leadership is not about standing in front. It is about standing with. True leaders are not those who command, but those who serve. My mission has never been to be the loudest voice in the room, but to be the amplifier for the voices that were never heard. I carry the stories of children, mothers, and survivors with me, not as burdens, but as guiding lights. They remind me why I do what I do. And I want every person listening to understand this. You do not have to be famous, wealthy, or powerful to lead. You only need the courage to care and the will to act. Leadership begins the moment you choose to make a difference, no matter how small. And when thousands make that choice, change is no longer a dream. It becomes unstoppable reality. Still, I know there is so much more to do. Even today, millions of girls remain out of school. Millions face violence, forced marriage, and inequality simply because of their gender. These are not distant statistics. They are our daughters, our sisters, our neighbors. And every time one girl is denied her right to dream, humanity itself is diminished. But the good news is that we are not powerless. Every action counts. Whether it is sponsoring a child's education, mentoring a young girl, raising awareness, or challenging injustice when we see it, we all have a role to play. Change does not happen in one sweeping gesture. It happens brick by brick, choice by choice, action by action. And if each of us commits to even one step, imagine the world we could create together. A world where every girl, everywhere is free to rise. Looking back on my journey, I often ask myself, why me? Why was I given this path? The answer is simple, because privilege demands responsibility. I was fortunate to have supportive parents, education, and opportunities. But privilege means nothing if it is not used to lift others. That is why I chose to dedicate myself to this mission. It was never about perfection. It was about persistence. Never about being flawless. It was about being fearless. And I believe the same is true for all of us. Whatever privileges we hold, time, knowledge, money, influence, they are not meant to be hoarded. They are meant to be shared. The measure of a life well lived is not how much we gather, but how much we give. And in giving, we discover the deepest form of fulfillment, knowing we left the world better than we found it. As I stand here now, I see a future that is not yet perfect, but undeniably brighter. A future where girls are no longer silenced, but celebrated. Where education is not a privilege, but a right. Where equality is not debated, but embraced. This is the world I dream of, and it is a world worth fighting for. But I cannot do it alone. None of us can. Real change requires all of us, hand in hand, heart to heart, refusing to accept injustice as normal. So, I leave you with this thought: never underestimate the power of your voice, your choices, your actions. Because together, we can create a world where every girl, every child, every human being has the chance to rise. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like this video and visit our channel for more powerful, life-changing stories. Your support helps us continue spreading hope and motivation to the world.